Alright folks, so in this video we're going to cut, mold, dye and sew until we end up with a couple of these pretty straightforward yet handsome little bell pouches. Thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing if you get something out of it. This is a silver Ranger compass I found in an antique shop probably 7 or 8 years ago. For me, it was like worlds colliding. It sort of came with this lovely old leather case that you don't really see anymore. And being into the outdoorsy stuff and just starting to get into some leather work, I was really taken by it. So they're a lovely object. I quite like making them. The design's really simple. It's got 3 separate components that you can sort of size up or down depending on your needs, and you can make them as plain or as fancy as you like. So just the disclaimer, this is just the way I do things, by no means the best way or the only way. So let's get stuck into it. Alright, the piece we start working on is the front form section. I'm using 5 to 7 ounce natural leather. It's cut from the shoulder. It forms well and retains good stiffness afterwards. Cut a piece out that's a couple of inches larger in all directions than you want to form. I start by edging, creasing and slicking the top or sort of mouth of this section. It's a lot easier to do it now than after it's formed. If you don't have a creaser, like a stitching groover will also leave that little decorative line that's parallel to that top edge. After you've done this, we'll give our leather a soak. I prefer warmish water for this. I feel like it leaves the leather a bit more malleable, and it's much nicer to stick your fingers in during the winter. Leave it to soak until you see the bubbles stop coming out, and then it's over to the mold. So you'll notice I have a timber mold that I made especially for doing this type of pouch. It's not really something you need to do. You could use a metal mint tin or anything that's just that kind of rectangular shape, sort of, hot glued to a piece of wood. Or if you have a plastic container, something that you think would work well for the intended use of your pouch. World's your oyster in this sense. The molding can be one of the more time-consuming bits. I start by sort of pushing the leather onto the mold with my fingers and then starting to shape it with a pen or a bone folder. The end of a Sharpie works really well. Take your time working on each side and slowly pulling the leather into shape. To do these, it probably took 10 to 15 minutes of just for forming, sort of working on it bit by bit and section by section. You'll probably get to a stage where you feel like you can't work a section without pulling a different bit out of place. So this is where a few clamps come in handy. The ones I have are just inexpensive welding clamps. They're like $1, $2 each. Alternatively, I've seen people putting a tack or a nail into the place that they want to hold down. You see around the corners, especially, the leather wants to lift and fold, so you can cut some little triangles out, which will just help to relieve the leather and help it bend into place. So just keep forming until you're happy with how it's sitting. Once your clamps or nails are holding it in place, you can either leave it to dry like that or move on to the optional next step. So if you take the time to make a timber mold, take the little bit of extra time just to make a positive for that so that you can then clamp that whole sort of assembly in one and let it to dry overnight. And that way it'll just really hold it into place and it'll keep a nice crisp edge. So after sitting overnight, we'll declamp, and the good thing about this time is that there's still quite a lot of moisture in the leather, so it's a really good opportunity to just take a molder if you have one, or just the underside of a teaspoon, and go around and just sort of flatten out any imperfections that you may have left over from the molding process. So after our soaking and molding, the front of the pouch will take a couple of days to dry out fully. Once it has, we'll poke some holes, getting ready for future stitching. I have a set of stitching irons that I like to use. They leave a really tidy little diamond-shaped hole. If you don't have these, don't stress. A fork will give you a nice sort of equidistant hole, and then you can just poke them through with an awl. Some folks like to use like one of those little marking wheels and then drill out the holes. It all works. Try to get your holes as close to the inside curve of the leather as you can. It tends to make for a tidier looking finished product, and it also just helps to kind of support that shape. So after that, measure out a line roughly 5mm from your stitching holes. Use a ruler or some wing dividers. This will give you something to cut to, which you will then do with a nice sharp knife. This particular pouch is going to be dyed a dark brown. You'll notice I'm using a fairly dodgy looking old brush. I don't recommend this. I ran out of wool daubers, and this was sort of the first thing that I put my eyes on. It didn't apply the dye particularly evenly, so it took a couple of applications to get it looking all right. If you do use dye, try not to get it on anywhere that you'll be putting down glue in the future, as it doesn't adhere as well. After dyeing, I like to leave it be for a while to really cure. So we'll move on to our other components, starting with the back sort of overflap section. I take some measurements from our molded piece, and then using the original silver compass pouch, I take the shape from that for that section that folds over the front. Cut this out and then go around the edges with all the usual stitch and groover edge sanding and a bit of slicking. I have a brass stamp that I use on my pieces, so I'll wet the leather, let it almost dry, place the stamp and hit the top of a mallet with a hammer. I find that this gives a really good impression, and you can sort of hit it more than once because the mallet being there will stop the stamp from bouncing out of place. So mark out where you intend to glue the sections together and then dye around them. And then we'll move on to the belt loop. It's a pretty simple affair. It measures roughly 10 centimeters long by 30 millimeters wide. I draw in a point to either end and then cut this to give it a pleasant shape. Then again, we groove, edge and slick. The only real variation here is skiving the ends so that when stitched it sits a little flatter. I like to have my belt loop well looped, so to speak. So I skive the underside at one end and then the top side on the other. So it's not often that my bench is clean, so I just took this as a bit of visual proof. Anyway, so our three components are made and it's time for assembly. We're going to start by putting the belt loop onto the back piece, because once our front's on, we wouldn't be able to get in there to stitch. So that's going to be, in terms of order of operations, that's where we start. I'll mark out where the top of the belt loop will be attached with an awl, and then use that awl to scratch up the surface so the glue sticks better. And you should note that I did exactly what I said you shouldn't do, and I dyed where the glue goes, and as a result it stuck like absolute garbage. I'll then use a cotton tip to put down some contact cement and then tap the joint with a hammer to help it adhere. Once that's on, mark out a line for your stitching and then punch some holes using whatever your preferred method is. And then once that's sorted, we get on to the first bit of stitching. I'm a fan of saddle stitching myself and use that method almost exclusively. And once you've got that inside stitching done, then just go and repeat the process for the outside one, and then our belt loop is complete. Next in the order of operation is setting up our hardware, which for this will be a solid brass Sam Browne stud. I'll use an awl to poke a hole where the stud will come through the flap, just eyeballing the symmetry. I'll then transfer this hole onto the molded section. I'll make my hole using punches and then use a knife to cut a little slit so that the stud can pass through that top hole a little easier. A dab of thread locker or super glue is your friend with these type of studs, especially when the back will be hard to reach later, therefore difficult to tighten. So then we will glue the molded section onto our backer, again just using some contact cement, which will then be tapped with a hammer. Then need to go and punch your holes all the way through if you did them earlier, or do them from scratch if you skip that step. Alright, and we're really onto the home stretch here, so then we've just got our final bit of stitching. Now, I tend to use wax cotton thread. I buy it from sort of marine shops. It's It's fairly inexpensive and it seems to hold really well. And again, saddle stitch and casting the stitch so that they lay over nicely on each other. And basically now it's just time for finishing. So I'll usually go back and sand the edges, wet them slightly, and then just use some low grit sandpaper. I think that's probably 80 to 100 grit. That will expose some of the natural leather underneath, so then you'll just need to go back and put down some dye. So for that I'll use a cotton tip. So then it'll just be whatever your preferred method of finishing is. So generally with my edges I'll use a bit of gum tragacanth, slick, and then give the whole project a really good soaking with some neat's foot oil, letting that to soak in and then buffing off the excess. And then a lot of the time after that's dried, I'll come back with some beeswax and rub the edges again with some wax and canvas. Okay, so that concludes this project. So you can see that I was working on 3 at once. There was the brown version, one I left natural, and then one where I laminated some leftover kangaroo skin to the outside flap. So it is really easy to modify and personalize, make it your own. They came up beautifully. If you've stuck it through to this part of the video, thank you so much for watching. And if you go one step further and give this project a try, I'd love to hear how you get on with it. If you found this tutorial helpful, let me know. If you thought it was rubbish, let me know. Thanks very much. And yeah, please consider subscribing if you liked it. Thank you.